Hello, everyone. This is your girl Javannah from Blackout Magazine, and I have the pleasure of sitting here with advocate and activist, award-winning advocate, activist, and author Raquel Willis. This is this is definitely a time that we're going to be speaking about the protests that happened last week on Capitol Hill. So yeah, let's start there. Raquel, how are you doing in the midst of the craziness last week?
Yeah, I feel very energized, um, and ready to fight and continue to fight for our people, for our dignity, for our humanity, um, for our power. So that's kind of how I feel coming out of last week. So we had a bathroom sit-in at Capitol Hill in response to, of course, Representative Nancy Mace and all of her bathroom bigotry agenda. We've
Yeah,
seen Speaker Mike Johnson um, essentially accept this policy for electeds to who are trans to not be able to use the restrooms that correspond with their truth.
right.
Obviously, that will impact Representative-elect Sarah McBride. And I think what's important and what was important for us was to be radically defiant in a moment where it seems like the GOP has carte blanche to do whatever they want to
Mhm.
trans people right now, and there has not been a sufficient response from Democratic leaders. And the Democrats claim to be the ones who believe in the rights and dignities of folks on the margins, including trans people, but we're
Right.
not seeing that.
Mhm.
And it's actually also not just about what Nancy Mace has been spewing, given her platform. It's about how trans folks were essentially left to fend for ourselves during the 2024 presidential election. We saw upwards of $215 million spent on ads, yes, to attack then candidate Kamala Harris, but also largely to attack trans people, incarcerated folks, migrants. And
Right.
so it's important for us to remember that context, remember the context of increasing anti trans legislation over the last several years, as a part of this fight, too.
Now, just to give a little bit of background, now you coordinated a protest for a sit-in basically in the restrooms at the Capitol, which was in the direct office of Nancy. Those offices, is that correct? Those collective offices where she was
So this,
specifically?
so this bathroom sit-in was on Capitol Hill in the, I think it's the Longsworth office building. I'll
Mhm.
have to fact check that. So this restroom is actually right across from Speaker Mike Johnson's
Mm.
office. So although we know Nancy Mace has been kind of the loudest on these kind of attacks of trans people right now, Speaker Johnson has essentially co-signed her
Mm.
policy, the policy that she put forth. Um, and so this bathroom sit-in was really a callback to historic sit-ins and civil disobediences throughout history. So thinking about the Greensboro sit-ins, the Woolworth counter sit-ins, right? Where folks were like, actually, racial discrimination is not okay. We're going to sit at this diner and you may not serve us, but what we're serving to you is radical defiance that actually this is not okay. And so let the world see how you treat us. Also thinking about another moment in 1966, the Julius sip in, so SIP in, not a sit in, a sip in. And this was gay folks who were being denied service, but also had their experiences deemed illegal or as disorderly conduct for being gay, openly gay at this time.
Right.
They said, actually, that's not okay. We're going to show up in a radically defiant way. And so, for us in this time where, again, trans folks are not being defended in the political sphere in the way that we deserve as human beings, we wanted to be radically defiant. And I think we were. You know, we had our banners. One of them said flush bathroom bigotry. That was the one on the inside. And then we had another banner on the outside that was a little spicier that said, stop, Congress, stop pissing on our rights.
Right.
And what was beautiful about our demonstration was that it was gender diverse. So there were cis folks as well as trans folks, as well as non binary folks in the mix. It was racially diverse: Black folks, white folks, Latinx folks, Asian folks, and on and on. It was also intergenerational and it was cross movement. So folks came from queer and trans organizing, folks came from anti-violence organizing, reproductive justice and abortion access organizing, folks from ACT UP, and of course fighting for those who are living and thriving with HIV and AIDS. So many different movements, and that's kind of what's at the core of gender liberation movement. And
Right.
GLM is a collective that I helped co-found this year, really to bring together the energies of reproductive justice and the fight for gender affirming care ahead of the hearing of the Skermeti case. But what we found is that also we need folks to be thinking about gender in a different
Right.
way, and gender as something that we can organize around if we can articulate how gender discrimination impacts everyone's lives, right? So we, in general, have a good grasp of how we need to be fighting against racial discrimination. We have, and I'm talking about in general in within the United States. I think in
Mhm.
some ways we have this understanding that um, we need to fight for reproductive justice and abortion access. And yet we're not making these connections around how the fight for abortion access is tied to the fight for gender affirming care, which is about bodily autonomy, but also how these fights to ban trans folks from public accommodations from restrooms is tied to these historical battles around racial
Mhm.
fights for access to the restroom. A lot of people don't want to hear that, right?
But that's what I saw when I saw the sit-in. It kind of,
Mhm.
as a Black person, it took me back to those days when we fought to use the whites only restrooms, or we were fighting at the counters to eat where the white folks were eating. So no one wants to see the intersections of these arguments that we're making that affects us in more ways than one. You know,
Absolutely.
so that is something that resonated with me with this protest.
And we constantly hear that, right? Especially for Black trans people. We
Mhm.
often hear, well, don't compare you being trans to being Black. And I'm like, well, baby, I'm both. So I think I'm an expert in understanding how these systems of oppression are in cahoots together, right? How they're connected together. Actually, it's my Black history. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a right to make this comparison. And you
Absolutely.
don't have a right to tell me that I don't have enough of a claim to Black history to make that distinct, make that connection clear. So, I think some people in maybe seeing images or some of the coverage of this started to see some of those connections between the fight. Um, and I'm encouraged by the response that we have received, the support that folks have given us. But I want folks to know, like, you also have to figure out how to be radically defiant in this time.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just say, oh, well, those are the rules. Oh, that's the law. Honey, if our ancestors did that every step of the way, we wouldn't be here.
Now, speaking of radical defiance, now you and several other people during this protest got arrested.
We did, yes.
What was that experience like?
So, civil disobedience on Capitol Hill is not an atypical thing.
Mhm.
Many of the folks that we worked with and also who were arrested have been a part of actions like this. Was it scary? Yes. Was telling my mom, you know, days before that like this was a possible had a possibility of happening scary? Yes. Um, but it also just felt necessary to put something on the line.
Mhm.
Um, and I also want to acknowledge the privilege of being able to take that risk um, for my values in a way that, like, a lot of our, particularly Black trans family, can't.
Mhm.
I think about so many of our folks over the years who have been drug into the system, right, without any kind of agency. And so I want to stress how important it is for us to constantly be thinking about how we show up for folks who are incarcerated,
Mhm.
show up for the folks who don't get to go home,
Right.
show up for the folks who maybe were able to leave being incarcerated or being in prison and who still need support, right? Are still struggling with unemployment, still struggling with violence in our communities. I think about the Ashley Diamonds of the world, a Black trans woman who dealt with a lot of discrimination while incarcerated over the last several years, and who was held in a men's prison, right, and experienced so much discrimination. I think about Kai Peterson, Black trans man, also from Georgia, who was arrested and became incarcerated after defending himself against his rapist
Mhm.
in self-defense. Um, so I think it's also important in this moment for us to understand when we take these risks, understand that the stakes are different for different
Mhm.
people.
Right.
And
You
that's
said
important.
it was scary. So I'm curious to know, how did that fear show up for you? Like, in your mind, what was your fear? Because we all have different experiences of fear. What was that for you?
I think more of my fear is about, and this is increasingly in terms of visibility right now, what is visibility or being known as someone who is outspoken or radically defiant going to mean
Mhm.
once there's a second Trump presidency? So back to the fear piece.
Mhm.
So A lot of the fear has just been this fear that's been with me since the election, and knowing that there's going to be a second Trump administration
Mhm.
and what that will mean in terms of the risk of being visible, the risk of being radically defiant with leadership that is not simply silent or inactive about our existence, but like actually accelerating some of the worst mindsets and legislation targeting our existence.
Mhm.
Now, I think just to bring it back, there was a little, I guess, anxiety around, well, will this go as smooth as, we plan for it to go? There was a hope that there wouldn't be any kind of brutality, that there wouldn't be kind of the risk of being held for an extended period of time. But you never
Mhm.
know, right? With the state, it could go any kind of way, really.
Mhm.
And then also thinking about, again, this increase in anti-trans sentiment, what kind of message maybe would the Capitol Police want to make? But we worked with some folks who were experts in safety and security, and also in terms of the legal aspect of the action, that really assured us and made sure that everyone came out the other side safe.
So everyone's out now. Everyone
Everyone is out, yes, and everyone was out by late that afternoon.
awesome. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, obviously, this is the beginning of the battle. We got a lot more we're going to have to prepare for. So
Uh-huh.
it's not the end. So what's next? What's next for you, the liberation movement? What are you guys seeing the tasks at hand to be?
Yeah, I think for a gender liberation movement, like a lot of people, activists, organizers, organizations, groups right now, a lot of it is really incubating around what is our best chance to do the most good, right? And keep folks the most safe and secure. For us, we're really focused on building out a bit of a radical newsroom to create content opportunities for authentic stories to be shared that speak to bodily autonomy, self determination, collectivism, and the pursuit of fulfillment. So, really creating that media that speaks to us and who
Mhm.
we are in a real way. Because we saw with the 2024 election, one of the biggest failures is that mainstream media in many ways has failed, particularly the trans community, but a lot of communities on the margins. And so-called liberal media has failed us as well, while there is this growing right-wing, bigoted media ecosystem that continues to ramp up. And we see it as Black trans people, we've been seeing it. Like, we've been seeing the shade rooms of it all, who like to make light of the experiences of trans folks, or put up these kind of questions around, um, well, what do y'all think about this? And like
Right.
basically instigate hate towards trans people. I've experienced it personally. Um, but that is a much larger issue than I think we realize. So the media piece is key. Continuing to find ways to be radically defiant, and send a message to leaders that their silence and inaction is not enough.
Mhm.
So what we're looking at continuing to do more direct action, building spaces for learning, and political education, but also building spaces for joy, and that elevate our culture. And then also looking at what policy considerations can look like in this next era. And that's probably the thing that's going to take the most amount of time, because we really kind of have to start seeing, well, what is the Trump administration going to move forward with? But
Mhm.
we do have to start figuring out, well, what is our antidote to Project 2025? Because we actually really don't have that. And that's why a lot of us have been caught on our behinds.
Need to
It's
figure out the
because,
solution. Mhm.
yeah, we don't have the solutions. What does it really look like to keep trans youth safe in schools, right?
Mhm.
What does it really look like to make sure that folks have access to the reproductive justice that they need, or the gender affirming care that they need? And oh, lo and behold, some people need all of that at
Mhm.
once.
All at
Um,
once.
and on and on.
So, how can the community support the work that you're doing? And would you suggest people all around the country in our audience, Blackout audience, to do the fight in anti-trans legislature?
Yeah, so I think it's about really building up power on the ground. Um, Obviously, I'm biased and I want folks to be paying attention to and supporting the efforts of gender liberation movement, but our work is largely national in nature. I do think it's important for folks to get tapped into local community groups and figure out who you're going to volunteer for. If you got coin, honey, donate to them, and on and on. Direct action work has been important in our community forever, and also mutual aid efforts. So we're going to have to lean into our communal histories to get us through this next era. And not just survive, right? We're going to have to continue to find um, joy and build new things, and that's going to happen regardless, because that's just who we are as a people. So I think those things are important. I
Mhm.
also think, for those who are men or masculine folks, y'all need to be building a movement, and like a healthier masculinities movement, because these men who saw Trump as a defender of them, who we know really isn't, they need somewhere to go. And y'all have to hold up that mantle, because they're not gonna listen to me, honey. So I think that piece is important. And I also think we need more coalition building between cis women and trans women.
Amen.
I've been doing a lot of that work of trying to be the glue in those spaces. And yes, it is draining AF.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I get that because that resonates with me very strongly because I run an organization, Wave Women Incorporated, and we
Mhm.
work it's our goal to work and build those bridges between transgender women and cisgendered women, specifically Black and Brown trans and cisgendered women. So
Right.
I'm always trying to get in all kinds of panels and coalitions and whatever else that will merge the two to build those bridges. So I totally agree.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that work has to happen. We really can't be fighting for gender affirming care without fighting for access to abortion, because a lot of the people who are trying to ban both of those are the same people. And a lot of those bans are happening in the same states and in the same places around the country. So we got to get our numbers up and figure this out. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
those are the few things I have. I also think, for trans folks and non-binary folks in this time, and we're already seeing this on the ground, people are making sure that they are getting their identity documents in order. There are organizations that are supporting folks to do that work. That's important as we go into this next era. Um, Figuring out opportunities to support each other in terms of access to healthcare, particularly hormone replacement therapy, but also opportunities for other types of therapy, other
Mhm.
parts of medical support for our community is so key, and getting funding for those things is going to be key, um,
Yeah.
particularly as we await whatever may happen in terms of insurance coverage and on and on. Um, and then
Well,
also
that
thinking
brings
about,
me to the, yeah,
well, the
go
last
ahead.
thing I'll say is safety and security,
Yeah.
right? So, like having your people in community that you can call when something
Hmm.
goes down, or you're, concerned or afraid, like that's important. Getting your digital safety and security up is also important. So, those are the things that are kind of immediately on my mind.
Yeah, and you kind of answered the my next question, because it's my next and final question actually. It was, do you have a message for folks that are terrified of living in this upcoming administration? So what advice would you give them? And you pretty much summed it up, but if there's something else you can share, like what would you tell people that are literally terrified of what's about to happen with this second Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, my message for folks who are terrified right now is that your feelings are valid, and there's a lot to be concerned about. Um, there is a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt between so many different communities.
Hmm.
Um, and I think what always gives me hope is leaning on the lessons of our ancestors, knowing that even though things feel like the worst they've ever been, that isn't necessarily true, that there have been not so great moments throughout history. And one of the things I was saying last week outside of the Supreme Court, when they were hearing the US v. Skermeti case, is we've always found a way. So even if you don't know what that way is going to look like right now, it's coming, right? And my examples are, ballroom tells us that we always find a way. We create our own things. The AIDS crisis of the 80s tells us that we always find a way. Now, did we lose people? And do we still mourn folks we've lost? Absolutely. But our people keep going, and we keep figuring out how to keep each other safe. COVID reminds us that we always find a way. And
Yeah.
so many things were built in a time of uncertainty. So those are the things that give me hope. And then I just think about, the babies, the little trans kids. There was a young trans girl named Mila who spoke outside of SCOTUS last week, and
Oh
she
yeah, she was
she
wonderful.
was
I heard that.
everything. She
Oh,
was like, I'm
man.
a trans girl and I'm proud. And
Yeah.
that just did something to me. Like, and I will carry that with me forever. But thinking about her and all the other young trans people who in some ways have more targets on their back than we ever did, because at least we were invisible, right? Like that's the thing about invisibility, is that sometimes it can be a shield from as bad as it could be, but they're still fighting alongside us. So those are the things that I often just lean into for strength.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Raquel. It's always a pleasure to see you. Please let us know how we can get in touch with you. How can we get
Yeah.
informed and, you know, get involved with the gender liberation movement? So tell us about.
Genderlib.org, just genderlib.org, and you can find us on all platforms. Reach out to us. We also obviously have a mailing list, so if you sign up, you'll get updates. And we'll get you engaged. We're going to be having a really amazing retreat this week. I'm really excited to see what kind of ideas we'll refine together for next year. But yeah, there's some options, so stay tuned.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Raquel Willis. And this is Javannah Davis from Blackout Magazine saying, God bless and take care of yourselves and each other.